Hi guys, this is the Automatinator. Today I'll be talking to you about UiPath input methods. Specifically, that's the simulate, send Windows message, and default input methods that you have available to you whenever you use UiPath's click or type into activities. Let's go ahead and dive in. So what are input methods and why do we have three of them to choose from? Well, if we take a look at the official UiPath documentation, which I'll include a link to down here in the description, you'll notice that depending on which input method you choose, UiPath is going to use a different background technology to perform your click or type into activity. For instance, if you use the default input method, UiPath actually reaches out to the hardware drivers on your computer. This might be your mouse or your keyboard hardware driver, and UiPath requests that the hardware driver simulate that click or type into activity. What this means in practice is that the default input method will often do something in the most human or user-like way possible. For instance, with a click activity, if you use the default input method, you'll actually see UiPath move your cursor across the screen before it clicks on whichever button or field you're attempting to click in. You won't see this type of cursor movement with either the send Windows messages or the simulate input methods. Secondly, we have our send Windows messages input method. With send Windows messages, UiPath actually sends a message with Windows. Surprise! It sends some background code or a background command via Windows to the target application you're interacting with, requesting that that type or click activity take place. And the key word here, the key feature here is going to be background. This is your first option if you want UiPath to perform an activity in the background. Lastly, we have our simulate input method. Simulate, like send Windows messages, can do things in the background. It's a background input method. Unlike send Windows messages, UiPath doesn't specifically use Windows to send this command. Rather, it reaches directly out to the application that you're interacting with, your target application, and requests that that target application tell UiPath what the best way is to either type or click into that application. So for instance, if you're using Notepad, UiPath reaches out directly to Notepad and asks Notepad, hey Notepad, what's the best way for me to type into you? Notepad tells UiPath this is the most efficient way to type in Notepad, and that is the method that UiPath uses. So that's the background technology for all three of these input methods. And before I get into best practice or just in general practice for how we as RPA developers should be using these input methods, I want to touch on the point I mentioned earlier, that key point being background versus foreground input methods. For background, you'll remember we have our send Windows messages and simulate input methods. And for the default input method, that's going to be our foreground input method. What is the difference there? I'll demonstrate that here in a second with a quick demonstration, and I'm also going to include a second demonstration where I show that even though both send Windows messages and simulate are background input methods, not all background input methods are created equal, and in a lot of situations, simulate will actually be your best bet if you're trying to perform something in the background. Let me get into those demonstrations. So for my first demo, I have a very simple setup. As you can see here on the left, I have Google opened in an Internet Explorer window. And over on the right, I have a very simple automation where I'm simply having the robot click on the sign in button over here on the left. So we'll know my automation has succeeded if at the end of the automation run, we are on this page with the Google sign in pulled up. One last thing I'm going to do, however, is I'm going to open my task manager. And I'm going to select this option from the Task Manager Options drop-down menu that says Always on Top. So if I select this Always on Top button, what you'll notice is that even if I move around another window or try to pull it up in front of this Task Manager window, that's not possible. Task Manager is always going to remain in the foreground. Everything else is going to be in the background. And specifically what I'm going to do with this always in the foreground task manager is I'm going to position it very specifically in front of our little sign in button right there. So task manager is in front of the sign in button that we are trying to click on with this robot. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cycle through. I'm first going to use check the simulate click input method. So run this automation with simulate click. I will then run it with send window messages. And finally, I will run it with the default input method. Let's see how things go. So if I select simulate click, go ahead and run my automation. can see right off the bat, my cursor did not move, but over here on the left, we did get to the Google sign-in page. So the sign-in button was clicked, even though Task Manager was over top of that button, and we did successfully get to the Google sign-in page. I'll switch that to our SendWindowMessages input method. Once again, because SendWindowMessages, like Simulate, is a background input method, you can see that over here we did get to the Google sign-in page, no problems at all. Finally, I'm going to use the default input method by unselecting both check marks over here on the right. So this is going to use the default input method, and when I run it this last time, first of all, one thing you'll notice, I haven't moved the mouse myself, but UiPath did its darndest. It did its best to try to click that sign-in button. You can see where my cursor's at. It's right over where that sign-in button was, but unfortunately Task Manager was in front of it. So UiPath was unable to click on the sign-in button due to the default input method being foreground only, and the automation did not perform as expected. We are still on the Google home page rather than the Google sign-in page. This is just a basic demonstration of what background versus foreground input methods should be doing for you. Those background input methods should be able to click behind stuff even if there's something in front of it. However, let me start my second demonstration here, because you will remember that earlier I mentioned that not all background input methods are created the same. So to set up my second demo, I'm simply going to add a couple of activities. I'm going to add a type into activity. I'm going to type into the Google search bar over here. Always want to do best practice and put in a name, appropriate name for my activity. And then this right here, we're actually going to click on Google search instead now. And for my search that I want to type into Google, let's say how to get to Athens. I've always wanted to go to Athens, have not got around to it yet, but that's going to be my Google search. So I will save that real quick. And now I'm going to go ahead and run this. No Task Manager this time, but much the same way that I did previously. I'll start out with simulate type methods for both activities. We'll see how that runs, then I'll move to SendWindowMessages, and then we'll wrap up with the default input method. So let me go ahead and run this with Simulate. You could see that run. As you can see over on the left, my search was successful. We got the how to get to Athens search result just as anticipated. Everything worked perfectly. I'll go back, reset my environment, switch my automation over here over to SendWindowMessages instead of Simulate Click, and run this again, and let's see what happens this time. All right, so if you were paying close attention, you'll notice that over here on the left, I have some different Google search results than I did last time. In fact, my Google search now says how to get to Athens from Santorini, rather than just the how to get to Athens that I requested the bot to type in over here on the right. Now, I might not want to get to Athens from Santorini. Maybe I want to get there from where I live here in the United States. So why did the bot type in or select something for my Google search differently from what I told it to select over here on the right? Well, let's do this one more time. I'm going to switch it over to the default input method, and I think that'll give us some kind of a visual hint as to what may have happened. So I'm going to run this one last time. Let me reset my environment. All right, with the default input method, here we go. All right, if you were closely observing what happens, you'll notice, first of all, over here on the left, this is where the robot moved my cursor. And now I'm actually going to back out. I'm going to myself, without the robot, type how to get to Athens, and then I'm going to move my cursor back to where it was on the screen. As we can see, right above the Google search button, I have my how to get to Athens from Santorini search result, which both the SendWindowMessages and default input methods actually ended up selecting for me when I used those methods to do this. So what happened? Basically, my click activity specifically, my type activities worked fine with all of those different input methods. There is no task manager up in front of this Google search bar where they're attempting to type. Even the default input method was able to type into the search bar. However, when we got to our click activity, only the simulate input method was actually able to reach behind this Google recommended searches menu here to click on the Google search button in the background that we wanted it to. Neither the SendWindowMessages nor the default input methods was able to do this, which is why they ended up clicking on what was in the foreground, or our how to get to Athens from Santorini search result. This is just one example of a situation where even though technically both SendWindowMessages and Simulate are considered background input methods, sometimes Simulate is just going to be a more robust and better option. So now let's talk best practice. From a best practice perspective, how should we, as RPA developers, be using these different input methods? How do we decide when faced with a new application or a new field we're attempting to interact with, which of these input methods we should be using? Well, in general, from a best practice perspective, there's a hierarchy you want to be following when deciding which input method you should choose. And that hierarchy begins by attempting to use the simulate input method first. Why is this? Well, the reason should be fairly obvious. First of all, simulate is one of our two background input methods. For all the reasons we discussed earlier, this makes it a more robust option than using the default input method, which is not always going to work for you. If something comes into the foreground, that default input method might fail. We also discussed a little bit ago how even though both SendWindowMessages and Simulate are background input methods, Simulate is actually the more robust of these two, so that's another reason to use Simulate first. Third, and perhaps not quite as important as the first two, but still important, especially for some automations, is that Simulate is the quickest of the three input methods. For your click activities, this difference in speed is going to be very minimal, but where it can really add up is going to be with your type into activities. Using type into with Simulate can really result in some time savings. And I show this with a demonstration. So here you can see I've set up my demonstration with two automations side by side. On the left, we have a robot that's going to use SendWindowMessages to type some Charles Dickens into this notepad window as quickly as it possibly can. You'll notice that I very specifically set the delay between keys to be 0 so that this automation is typing as quickly as it possibly can using SendWindowMessages. And then on the right, we have a automation that's going to do the exact same typing, only it's going to use the simulate input method. I'll go ahead and kick these off and let's see how it goes. So there's really not much of a competition here. I mean, to be fair, SendWindowMessages is typing a lot quicker than I can, but obviously Simulate is the winner by far in this situation. You should be able to tell how, depending on how many words your automations are going to need to be typing, this type of time savings could really add up over time if you use Simulate rather than SendWindowMessages for your automations. Unfortunately, not all applications are going to work with the Simulate input method. According to UiPath documentation, about 60% of desktop applications are compatible with the Simulate input method, and about 99% of web applications are supposed to be compatible with the Simulate input method. Although I will note, on that 99%, it's definitely a 99% and not a 100%, as I myself have personally encountered web applications that do not interact appropriately with the Simulate input method. When I say will not work or is not compatible, what do I mean by that? Well, the most likely scenario that you'll encounter if a given application or element is not compatible with the simulate input method is that you'll have that click or type into activity in your UiPath workflow. There will not be any error or anything like that, but when you go to run your automation, UiPath will simply pass on by that activity and nothing will happen in your target application as far as the click or the type that you anticipated should happen. Your automation might error out a little bit later on due to that click or that type not happening, but you probably won't actually error out on that activity. It's just going to pass on by as if that activity weren't even there. If you encounter this sort of situation, again, the most likely scenario is that you've encountered an application that is not fully compatible with the simulate input method, and your next course of action should be to move on and attempt to use our second input method in our hierarchy of input methods that we want to be using from a best practice perspective. And the second input method that we'd like to use, if possible, is going to be our SendWindowMessages input method. Why SendWindowMessages? Well, the reason is pretty simple with SendWindowMessages. This is simply because, as mentioned previously, SendWindowMessages is a background input method. This gives us all of the more robustness, the ability to click behind things that may have popped into the foreground that I discussed earlier in my demonstration. I won't go back into that again. You can back up if you want to see that. But this is why SendWindowMessages should be our second option in our hierarchy of which input methods we're using. Finally, UiPath says that SendWindowMessages should be compatible with about 80% of applications across the board, but with that last 20%, if you happen to run into that last 20% of applications that would not work with either simulate or SendWindowMessages input methods, your last and final course of action should be to revert to the default input method. So, just to recap, we have our hierarchy of input methods, and the order that we want to attempt to use input methods in whenever we're encountering a new application or a new element should be, first of all, to try the simulate input method. Secondly, if that does not work, go ahead and try the SendWindowMessages input method. And finally, if all else fails, you can then revert to the default input method. We've already discussed how the simulate and SendWindowMessages input methods are able to operate in the background, and how this makes them a more robust solution than the default input method, which is only able to operate in the foreground. What I didn't mention previously was that this concept, and the need to use the background input methods rather than the foreground input method whenever possible, is even more important when we start to discuss attended automations which may be running alongside human users on their devices rather than in their own separate environment. Whenever you're creating an unattended automation, that is, an automation that will be running on its own virtual machine, away from human user interaction in a headless environment, you can often get away with using the default input method. This is because there's nothing interfering with that robot. The robot is able to do what it needs to do. Things are not likely to pop into the foreground at unexpected times. Unfortunately, when you have a human user on the computer, the risk of something happening that will upset the bot is increased, and this risk is only amplified if you're using the default input method rather than either SendWindowMessages or simulate as our background input methods. I think the best way to show this is via a quick demonstration. To demonstrate this concept, I put together a fairly simple setup with Paint. So on my left here, I have my Paint window open, and on the right, I have my automation, which, as we can see, is going to attempt to click the Fill button up here in my Paint menu bar, and then click within the Paint workspace to fill in this pretty light blue color that I've selected over here. You'll notice that right now, both of these click activities are using the default input method. Neither SendWindowMessages nor simulate click is selected. And I'm just going to go ahead and run this automation, and let's see what happens. So I ran this automation, and we can see that it worked just fine. Over here on the left, it did successfully select fill, and it filled in that light blue color by clicking in the middle of this space over here within Paint. Let me clear that out, and I'm actually going to run the automation one more time, as is, without changing anything per se, here in UiPath. I'm going to leave things with the default input method selected, and I'm not going to change anything about these activities. What I am going to do differently is that during this automation run, I'm going to simulate a human user being on the computer at the same time as an attended automation. How am I going to do that? Well, what's something that human users like to do? Human users like to move their mouse around. They like to open things up. They like to go click on different windows and see what's going on, even while attended automations are running on their computer. Even if you, as the RPA developer, instruct the people with the attended automations on their computer not to touch anything, chances are that this is a situation that's going to occur. Someone's going to touch a mouse while an intended automation is running. So let's go ahead and run this automation with me moving the mouse around, and let's just see how it works. All right, so what happened here? Clearly not what we anticipated. Let me go ahead and open my Paint back up again. So what happened? Well, UiPath attempted to do what we told it to do. It attempted to click on the fill button over here, first of all. Unfortunately, I was moving my mouse around so quickly that when it attempted to perform that click, it moved the mouse over here. As we saw with the default input method, it will actually move the cursor. But before it had time to click, I'd already moved my mouse up here to the menu bar for the paint window, and so I ended up moving that paint window around. It looks like it even resized, so maybe I moved it to one of the corners of paint here. Secondly, when we attempted to click in the workspace, it did click in the workspace, and we can see that I was moving my mouse around chaotically still. It didn't click fill, so it still had brush selected, and I actually drew some random lines here within the body of paint. Obviously, this was not what we wanted to happen. We wanted to see it click on the fill button here, click in here, and have something more like this occur. So what do we need to do to resolve this situation? Well, one option is going to be to change our input method to be one of the background input methods. So I'm going to use SendWindowMessages now for both of these activities, and I'm going to repeat the exercise a minute ago where I run this automation while moving my mouse around haphazardly. Here we go. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The automation ran just fine despite me moving my cursor around the screen. With SendWindowMessages, the robot doesn't really care where the cursor is at. It's sending the message directly to this window. It's telling it where to click without any care in the world for where the cursor is at, and so is able to perform that automation despite me, the human user, moving my mouse around while the automation was running. So that's my demonstration of just one scenario where in an attended automation that's running alongside a human user, the use of a default input method would result in the automation actually failing to perform as anticipated, where the same automation, if using a background input method, so either simulate or SendWindowMessages, would actually perform just perfectly fine, even if the human user was messing around with the mouse or doing things during the automation. Realize that this is just one scenario. There's other similar scenarios, such as a human user pulling up a different application or window in front of the one that you're trying to interact with, and that causing the default input methods to fail in those type or click activities. There's other scenarios like that that you need to be aware of as well. But in general, just realize that when creating attended automations, it's that much more important that you use the background rather than the foreground input methods. So before I shut down Paint, I'm actually going to perform one more demonstration. This demonstration doesn't actually have to do with what we were just talking about as far as using background input methods, specifically when creating attended automations. But it does have to do with something I spoke about earlier, which is to demonstrate exactly how a UiPath automation will fail if you attempt to use an input method with an application that is not compatible with that input method. So for this last demonstration, I'll go ahead and switch both of my click activities over to use the simulate input method. Then I'll go ahead and kick this automation off while moving my mouse around some to simulate a human user, just as I did for the last two demos. So the first thing we'll notice is that UiPath did successfully click the fill button over on the left in the paint window. This should be something we anticipated since, like the SendWindowMessages input method, simulate is a background input method, and thus it doesn't matter where the cursor is. It doesn't matter if I'm moving the cursor around. The simulate input method should still be able to click directly on whatever button it was that I instructed it to click on. The second thing we'll notice, though, is that even though it did click on the fill button, UiPath did not click into the body of the window over on the left. It did not fill the light blue color in the window in Paint. Now, why was this? As it turns out, and the only reason I know this is due to trial and error, Simulate does not work or is not compatible with the body of the window in Paint. It is only compatible with the menu bar in Paint. Thus, because Simulate was not compatible, UiPath moved right past the Simulate click activity that was meant to fill the light blue color into the body of the window in Paint, and continued right on to the end of the automation. You'll notice that we did not experience any error. UiPath just went by that activity as if it did not exist. This is exactly what I discussed earlier as just kind of a demonstration of how UiPath will fail if the input method you're attempting to use is not compatible with the target application that you're interacting with, you're not likely to experience an error, but you will rather just see the activity bypassed as if it didn't exist at all. Tip number 1. For each type into or click activity you create, you can only use one input method. You'll either be using the simulate input method by checking its corresponding checkbox, the SendWindowMessages input method by checking its checkbox, or selecting the default input method by checking neither checkbox. If you accidentally select both of those checkboxes at any time, you'll notice that UiPath actually gives you a validation error. It's going to give you one of those little blue exclamation marks that will actually prevent you from running your automation at all. So that is not an option. You can only use one input method per activity. Tip number 2. If you ever are forced to use the default input method, particularly with a type into activity, say the simulate or send window messages would not work with the application or the element you're attempting to interact with, one thing that you can do to mitigate the risk involved with using the default input method and its foreground nature is to check the activate checkbox in the properties panel of your type into activity. What this activate will attempt to do is before your type into begins to happen, it will try to pull that target application or the target window that you're wanting to interact with to the foreground. So even if something else were to have popped in front of that window or that application before you began typing, hopefully checking activate will bring it to the front so that your activity will not fail and your robot will continue to run as intended. Tip number 3. Although simulate is our golden child input method that we want to use whenever possible, unfortunately in UiPath, the send hotkeys activity is unable to use the simulate input method. You'll notice that if you open up a send hotkey activity in the properties panel, you will not even see the checkbox for the simulate input method because this simply is not an option. What this means is that even if you've been able to interact with a given application using simulate for all of your type and click into activities, if during the course of your automation you need to send a shortcut, send any sort of hotkey to that application, you're going to have to revert to using either send window messages or the default input method. This is more something to be aware of. There's no great way to get around this, but something to be aware of, and that you may need to do certain things, especially if you end up having to use that default input method to make sure your application is in the foreground on top of everything else before you attempt to send it a hotkey using UiPath. All right, that's all I've got for today. If you have any comments on the current video or thoughts on additional tutorials, demos, anything else that you'd like to see in the future, please don't hesitate to leave a comment down in the section below. Also, if you liked this video, please do like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it, and that'll help me create content like this for you all in the future. For now, this is the Automatinator, and thanks again for watching my video.